Memory of the wars that occurred in the former Yugoslavia between 1991 and 1999 are still very much present in the region today, and at times it seems like there are reminders on almost every street corner. However, many of these memory sites continue to foster tension in the region between the different sides involved, with each country's leadership seeking to use these spaces of memory to communicate their own official versions of what happened and what people should learn from them. My name is Joe Georgievsky, and I'm an environmental historian from the United States with family roots in the former Yugoslavia. And I've been exploring the connections between public memory, environment, and the legacies of war in the region in hopes that more cooperation between communities of the former Yugoslavia can be achieved through public memory. Now, in my previous video, the link to which can be found in the video description, I tried to expose some of the lesser known and at times invisible consequences that the wars had on the region's environments, which continue to affect the populations living in them, but have, for the most part, been completely left out of spaces of public memory. In my opinion, wars' environmental impacts are usually left out because they're, well, first of all, hard to trace, but also they don't always show clear-cut lines between victims and aggressors. And they can impact anyone in the region, crossing between ethnic, national, religious, and political boundaries. But also importantly, they don't quite live up to the promises of each country's official tourism boards, which hope to draw tourists to places once impacted by war by portraying them as pristine, untouched, and safe. So in this video, I want to explore some of the ways we can rethink how the wars are remembered, especially in places undergoing rapid touristification, so that they don't get lost to what is often called collective amnesia, or the phenomenon of intentional public forgetting. And also, just maybe, if we can create spaces for remembering how war impacted the region's environments, public memory can be used as a tool not for division over the past, but for understanding in the present and action for the future. Especially now, in this global world that we live in, where environmental changes pay no attention to borders. Now, some of the most important sites of war in the region are still preserved today. But they only focus on one specific group's feelings of victimhood, and they say little about the broader and deeper impacts war can have on any given community. Now, just to be clear, I think that these types of monuments are important and should continue to be preserved, but I also believe that they don't tell the entire story. Other important memorial spaces are dedicated to the innocent victims of war and atrocities, and of course, they need to be remembered. But this doesn't tell the whole story either, because meanwhile, the countless landmines that remain hidden in the region's forests and agricultural lands have claimed thousands of victims since the end of the wars. The homes and dwellings of people from all nationalities that were either killed or forced to flee during the wars remain abandoned and pollute the landscapes in their own ways, while unrecorded amounts of pollution from the destruction of industrial facilities have contaminated the soil, air, and waters, especially in the rivers that connect communities across national borders. And yet, you won't find any monuments to the victims of these environmental problems, and you won't find very many destroyed landscapes preserved to inform people about how wars can leave physical scars on our planet's ecosystems. In order to better understand how and why environmental legacies of the wars often remain hidden from public spaces, even though they continue to affect people, I visited one of the most famous places that went from being on the front line of war in Croatia to being one of the region's most famous tourist destinations. Plitvice Lakes National Park is the pride and joy of Croatia, and it is the most visited place in the country outside of its famous Adriatic coastline. While Plitvice already began a process of mass tourism in the 1970s while it was a part of Yugoslavia, today it attracts more than 1.5 million tourist arrivals per year, mostly during the summer, who come in hordes to battle for photos of its beautiful blue waterfalls and lakes. But when visiting the national park and strolling along its crowded walkways, there's almost no way for tourists to know that just around 30 years ago, it was right at the front line of Croatia's War of Independence. Between 1991 and 1995, the national park and its surroundings were under the breakaway province of Serbian Krajina, where battles were fought between Croatian and rebel Serb forces and where atrocities were committed. The area was also under the jurisdiction of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Yugoslavia, known as UNPROFOR, since 1992, and many of its surroundings still bear the scars of war. Plitvice's official office and Croatia's National Tourist Board, however, have mostly taken on the approach of creating an image of untouched natural beauty, while ignoring and forgetting the legacies of conflict. In my opinion, to the detriment of present and future generations, learning about how wars can affect people and their environments across the globe. In fact, the only space given to the memory of the war around the park is a monument to Special Policeman Josip Jović, who is considered to be the first ethnic Croat fighter killed during the war, when Croatian police and rebel Serbian forces clashed in the national park on Easter Sunday of 1991. But the Josip Jović monument, for the most part, is left out of the gaze of tourists and is separated from the park's main entrances. After the Bloody Easter event in 1991, which saw the conflict take a more violent turn, UNESCO placed the national park on the list of World Heritage Sites in danger. The Croatian Park Administration, exiled during the war in Zagreb, accused the Serbs of committing ecocide and destroying the park. But in 1992, UNESCO sent a group of experts, accompanied by Czech UN Pro-4 troops, to investigate the state of Plitvice lakes. Based on their observations, they claimed that both sides of the conflict had mostly respected the park's environment, and that it had actually benefited from the absence of tourism, since its natural properties were allowed to continue unmolested by crowds of tourists. So in a sense, they argued that the war actually helped the park's environment. However, the UNESCO experts were mostly concerned with how much of Plitvice's tourism offer was salvageable, and later reports showed that there were multiple cases of vandalism in the park, illegal logging, use of dynamite fishing in the lakes and streams, and even landmine contamination in the park's Čorkova Uvala forest. Not to mention, most of the inhabitants of the small rural communities in and near the park were forced to flee while many were killed, and even today, several houses and buildings around the park remain destroyed and abandoned, which has contributed to the decline of agriculture in the region as well as its overdependence on tourism. Ličko Petrovo Selo is one of the small rural communities in the national park's orbit, and like many other towns in the vicinity, it suffered heavy damage during the war and many of its inhabitants left and never returned. Today, many of the people who live here are elderly members of the Serbian Orthodox minority in Croatia, and the town suffered heavily at the hands of the World War II Nazi puppet Ustasha regime. But then during the war in the 1990s, some rebel fighters from the town committed their own acts of ethnic cleansing in nearby villages inhabited by Croats, including the burning down of a Catholic church in the neighboring town of Vaganac. The town is full of memory, especially from the World War II partisan struggle and the socialist Yugoslav period, including parts of the impressive underground Željava airbase. I met with a local tour guide who also runs the Tara community group based in the village, which is an association for local women that includes production, exhibition, and marketing of local goods and handicrafts considered to be a part of the village's heritage, including the infamous nakurnjake, or, well, I guess kind of knitted socks for men's privates, an important practice that dates back to the era before the invention of modern underwear. I reached out to my guide, Sonja Leka, in hopes that she could show me around the area and help me understand how the disappearing community preserves its heritage and memory in the face of rapid tourism development stemming from Plitvice lakes. I was attracted to this specific community after reading a 2020 BBC report on how a new Slovenian-owned hotel is taking major steps towards keeping the town afloat and helping it recover from the traumas of wartime depopulation and enduring ethnic tensions. But during my visit with Sonja, I was surprised by the amount of abandonment and neglect that still marks much of the area. It quickly became clear to me that places like Ličko Petrovo Selo and their spaces for memory of war and the Yugoslav past don't line up so easily with how the country's tourism board wants to present the area. Croatia's tourism strategy since its independence has been to promote a series of allegedly pristine landscapes, as reflected in its previous official tagline, "The Mediterranean as it once was." But also, the goal has been to promote safety and fun, with newer slogans like "Croatia full of life" and "Safe stay in Croatia." So places that were heavily impacted by the wars in the 1990s through militarization, pollution, and neglect are left in the awkward position of trying to play catch-up and live up to this standard, In fact, many of these places, especially in the Lika region where Plitvice lies, are officially labeled by the Croatian government as područja posebne državne skrbi, or areas of special state concern, where special public attention is needed in terms of war remediation and assistance towards development. And increasingly, the state's approach seems to be more and more reliant on tourism as the way forward. In Croatia's Rural Development Plan, tourism continues to feature as one of the main drivers of economic development. In the National Plan for 2020, Ministry of Agriculture planners suggested that the use of tourism to initiate the development of rural areas must be one of the key drivers of overall development. While these types of plans often highlight the need for environmental sustainability in the strategy to attain maximum growth, there are usually no mentions of how to manage spaces for memory. So with all this focus on tourism as a way to move past the effects of war, I wanted to know if tourism can do this while preserving memory of conflict as well as other memories that don't quite conform to the official narrative. Sonja took me to the mostly abandoned Željava airbase and military complex, which served an important role during the Cold War, but was used and subsequently damaged during the Croatian War of Independence. Like many of the communities close to tourist destinations throughout the region, the complex has transformed the landscape into one of neglect, where unknown and unrecorded amounts of pollution from the uncontrolled structures and overgrowth impact the water, soil, and air in ways we don't yet know. It seems to me like this important site of cultural and historical heritage, in its close proximity to the national park, would make for a great opportunity to preserve memory of how conflict can impact environments. But Sonja isn't quite as optimistic.
Our government don't want to have anything.
Yeah.
Government wants that to be ruined totally.
In her experience with guiding hundreds of foreign tourists each season, she tells me that visitors seldomly show interest in the area's heritage or its memories.
It was full.
Yeah.
You know, every day they had, every night, 3 buses because there is 60 rooms. And those are the groups which are visiting Plitvice Lake, staying one day, one night, and going further on.
Sonja believes that tourism has its benefits, especially for shrinking rural communities throughout the former Yugoslavia, but isn't quite convinced that it can be an ally for preserving those communities' heritage and memories. But I wasn't ready to give up on the idea of incorporating memory of war and its environmental destruction in touristic or tourist-defying areas. In order to find an example of a touristic landscape that incorporates memory of war's environmental destruction, I visited Pot Miru, or the Walk of Peace, in Slovenia. The Walk of Peace is located along the Soča River Valley and connects the borders of Slovenia, Austria, and Italy, where it incorporates a path along the Piave River. The site is heavily visited by nature and adventure-seeking tourists who are drawn to the incredible views of the Julian Alps and the impressive blue waters of the Soča. The Soča River Valley, however, was also the setting of the Isonzo Front of World War I, where more than 1 million soldiers died in fighting between Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces. And between 1915 and 1917, it was one of the bloodiest and most destructive warscapes of the Great War. And today, ossuaries, monuments, trenches, and bunkers from the war still imprint the landscape more than 100 years later. I was drawn to the Walk of Peace as a potential site of inspiration or even a model for ways to promote public remembrance of the effects of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, since its goal is to first and foremost promote peace, while also informing visitors and guests coming to the site for touristic purposes about how the First World War affected the people involved in it, as well as the landscape and surrounding environment. For example, along the path to the Kozjak waterfall, a famous site for selfie taking which costs about €5 to enter, there are signs that point visitors towards nearby trenches and bunkers from the war. While in the town of Kobarid, a visitor center and museum inform tourists about the context of the war and its tremendous human and environmental costs. The Walk of Peace's official website, in my opinion, does a pretty good job communicating to potential visitors how war and environment have become intertwined in the area, and that the goal is to incorporate memory into the tourist site. So the idea for the Walk of Peace is that by hiking and visiting these memory sites in a difficult but beautiful landscape, visitors might be able to reach deeper reflections about peace and war and the environment. But it isn't quite clear how effective this approach really is. For example, when you look at reviews from the Kozyak waterfall, very few of the people commenting even mention the nearby trenches and bunkers from the First World War. Now, while the Walk of Peace has also been criticized by some observers for inauthenticity and even in some cases for glorifying war, the few scholars who have written about it seem to agree that it does live up to some of its goals. According to researcher Maria Cristina Paganoni, a positive effect of the kind of language used in the promotion of the Walk of Peace is its nonviolent tone, which refrains from assigning blame and avoids the war rhetoric of dying for one's country. Instead, mutual knowledge, collaboration, and free movement in the Schengen area are promoted. But this brings up another important point. Other parts of the former Yugoslavia have far less economic privileges and opportunities than the borderless Schengen and unified currency zone that Slovenia, Italy, and Austria have for the Walk of Peace. While national border crossings, different currencies, lingering ethnic divisions, and a lack of infrastructure still characterize much of the former Yugoslavia today. And also, the Wars of Yugoslav Succession are still sources of political tension between former Yugoslav republics, whereas World War I has almost universally been condemned as a senseless conflict and even earned the long-standing moniker, the war to end all wars. But in my opinion, the Walk of Peace along the Socha River Valley has definitely demonstrated that commemorating war's environmental damages in places heavily commodified for tourism is at least possible. Now, there are some sites in the region that do seek to preserve and display memories of how war in the 1990s has affected environments and landscapes. For example, there have been efforts to preserve the trenches at Golo Brdo above Sarajevo, which were used during the battle for the city during the Bosnian War. And in Croatia, a memorial park at Barutana does a pretty good job, in my opinion, reminding people of the physical destruction caused by war in 1991. As I mentioned in my previous video, a munitions warehouse was deliberately blown up by JNA officer Milan Tepic in 1991, which killed 11 Croatian soldiers, left a huge crater, and destroyed much of the surrounding Bedenik forest. Today, the memorial park, somewhat similar to the trenches and bunkers at the Walk of Peace, preserves the physical damages caused by the explosion and provides an informational trail. However, the site is not part of any kind of bigger official project to promote peace in the region or to demonstrate the horrors of war more broadly, like Slovenia's Walk of Peace. After conducting research on the environmental impacts of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, it's become clear to me that we still don't know the full extent of the destruction and how much of it is still affecting the people living in the region today. So more studies are needed, which is actually maybe even encouraging, since that means that there's plenty of room for the public and for scholars and political leaders to engage more with this topic. But what I find most troubling is that many of the environmental impacts from the wars that we do know about are nowhere to be found in public spaces dedicated to memory of the wars. And in touristic areas that were themselves once warscapes, I believe that we're missing out on a great opportunity to help educate people on the different ways that wars can leave deeper marks on environments that continue to affect people long after the guns fall silent. And environmental problems similar to those caused by war in Yugoslavia continue to repeat themselves across the globe. While landmines have created environmental problems in Croatia and in Bosnia especially, around 17% of Vietnam's land is still contaminated with landmines from the Vietnam War. And the present war in Ukraine has led to at least 30% of its land surface being contaminated with landmines. While the destruction of the Kakova Dam in 2023 led to the flooding of thousands of hectares of land. And there are, of course, countless other examples of environmental destruction from global conflicts throughout the entire world. While tourism is of major economic importance in all of the independent countries of the former Yugoslavia, brushing aside memory of the war's environmental legacies in favor of presenting a picture of undiscovered landscapes for foreign tourists, and the lack of public space for cultures of remembrance, threatens the things that we can learn with the fate of collective amnesia and fading into oblivion. But because the environmental destruction of war crosses multiple ethnic, national, religious, and political boundaries, cooperation is desperately needed for us to not only get a better understanding of the environmental toll of the wars, but also to address how they continue to affect people living in this region and what can be done about it. Perhaps a site or a series of sites on the scale of the Walk of Peace is not possible for this region, but at least I believe that we can and should create more spaces for remembering.